That's right, folks. Another episode of the Razzball Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm your host, Bobby LaMarco, and today we're breaking down the rest of season slot versus wide analysis. Find out which wide receivers have the best rest of season schedule out wide in the slot and how you can take advantage of that with some trades starting right now on the Razzball Fantasy YouTube channel. And once again, it's Friday, folks, and they got those Friday vibes and Saturday vibes down under. It's Ben Wasley, by the way. You can follow him at Fantasy First Down, no on Twitter. Ben, what's going on, man?
I mean, look, it's a Saturday. It's pouring with rain because it's nearly summer here, and that's how we love it. It's keeping it nice and cool because it was very, very, very warm this week. I'm just enjoying the slightly cooler weather, and it comes with a little bit of dampness.
Nice. I love it, man. Listen, so first off, honestly, Ben, this week we're taking a little bit of a break from our normal scheduled programming because fantasy football trade deadlines are right around the corner. And we want to talk a little bit about some of the rest of season slot and out wide strength of schedules to help you find some trade targets. So if you haven't heard, by the way, and if you haven't checked out razzball.com, we have had some fantastic tools over there all season long, and we're really excited about the rest of season slot versus wide strength of schedule tool that we recently put up there as well. This is, by the way, hyper-focused on just wide receiver receiving data and how many fantasy points a defense allows in the slot versus out wide and which offenses have the best rest of season schedule. So, Ben, before we dive kind of into this, what is kind of your overall trade philosophy heading into the trade deadlines? What's your kind of thoughts here? Are you really hyper-focused on playoff schedules? Is it based on teams? Give us kind of your overall thoughts about trades going on.
I think you need to be really aware of where you're at. Are you locked into the playoffs? Your team's really strong. You're basically just trying to lock it down, make sure that you're sorted for the playoffs. If that's the case, then the playoff schedule makes all the difference in the world because that's all you care about at this stage. Are you fighting for a playoff spot? Maybe you've had some injuries. Maybe you're recovering from a difficult start. In that case, this tool is going to be really useful because it's going to give you help across that broad span of games that we're interested in. Or maybe, just maybe you're struggling and you're a couple of games out from a playoff spot. And in that case, you really just need to think about next week. You need to think about plays that are going to help you straight away. So definitely be aware of that because when we talk about players, we're definitely going to talk about the situation they apply to, and you need to understand whether that's for you or whether there are other people that might be better for your situation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And honestly, one of the guys we're going to talk about right off the top is one of those guys where if you're trying to get into the playoffs, you're going to trading for him makes a ton of sense. But once you get there, things are going to get really tough for him. And we'll talk about that player in just a second. But I want to tell people where you can actually go and find the content. By the way, if you haven't checked it out on Razzball.com, the fantasy data tab, like we already brought up. And by the way, before we even start, give us a like, rate, and review on the Razzball Fantasy YouTube channel. We really do appreciate it. Give us a follow. We have a lot of fun shows coming up. We have a handcuff show. We have a defense of playoff preview. We have the rest of season. We already did the rest of season trade targets on Wednesday, but we'll have a slot versus wide playoff preview in the next week or two as well. So stick with us. We're going to have a lot of unique shows coming up. But if you go to the razzball.com, click on the NFL tab at the top, and you hover over to the fantasy data tab, this is where you'll find the 2024 slot versus wide rest of season strength of schedule. So this is a really good tool that you can actually use. Now, granted, as a reminder, this is just receiving data. And so it's looking at receiving the strength of schedules for players in the slot and out wide. And so the offense is in this column right here. And this is really just showing which offenses have the best out wide and slot schedules. Now, you might be asking yourself right off the bat, like, hey, how do I know my receiver gets a lot of fantasy points out wide in the slot? Great question. We actually do have another tab. If you go to the wide receiver fantasy points scored in the slot versus out wide, you can actually find out where your wide receiver gets their fantasy points. It's a really cool tool. Obviously, this is just fantasy points data. Doesn't mean necessarily they line up 50-50 in the slot and out wide, but it is showing that they do get some fantasy points, which honestly, in the grand scheme of things, that's all we really care about. are they getting fantasy points? I don't care if they get 1,000 snaps in the slot, but are they getting fantasy points from the slot is kind of what we want to see there as well. But today's show is kind of identify some trade targets from this data. And the first thing we're going to do is look out wide because that's where our bread is buttered. And the first guy that really stands out, if you click on the points per game allowed using the top header here, the first one is the Pittsburgh Steelers. And what that tells me is you want to be looking at George Pickens. Now, Ben, when I was looking into the data, they got the Ravens, the Browns, the Bengals, the Browns again, and the Eagles in the next 5 weeks. All those, the Ravens, Browns, Bengals, and Browns, again, those 4 matchups are all in the top 5 in fantasy points allowed out wide. The issue with George Pickens is that if you get to the playoffs, he has the Eagles and the Chiefs, who are really tough matchups out wide. What's your thoughts here, Ben? Is George Pickens a player you're willing to target right now based on this schedule?
I think he's the perfect player to get you into the playoffs. So we talked about understanding your situation. If you're already locked into the playoffs, Pickens isn't going to help you that much. You're going there anyway, and he's not that strong with his actual playoff run. We've seen what can happen with Terry McLaurin with that matchup against the Eagles, for example. On the other hand, if you need wins now, gosh, he's going to get you a lot of points over the next month or so. We've seen teams popping off against all of these opponents, against the Ravens and the Bengals in particular. So I want George for that run into the playoffs. And once I'm in the playoffs, hopefully I can just work it out then.
So the other question I have is really here is on the flip side of all this, like who are the guys with some tough schedules? And if you go scroll down, you'll find some notable names. Guys like the Seattle Seahawks, DK Metcalf has the toughest out wide remaining schedule. You guys got like Puka Nacua, Brian Thomas, Amari Cooper, Jalen Waddle, Terry McLaurin, Michael Pittman, and another name that is kind of going to be interesting to talk about here is CeeDee Lamb, who of course is mostly in the slot now, but the Cooper Rush situation last week, listen, we might have a different conversation if he catches that 1 touchdown pass, but he did not. I guess my question for you is, are you willing to trade guys like DK Metcalf and Puka Nacua to get George Pickens if you're on the outside looking in right now?
I feel like a DK Metcalf is kind of where we're looking. We know that he's coming off an injury. There is usually a little bit of a ramp-up period there. If you need wins right now, expecting DK to come straight in and pop off with his tough schedule, that's expecting a lot. If I had the choice, I'd rather go for George Pickens. And I feel like with kind of the name recognition you get from a DK Metcalf, I feel like you've got a real chance there. I mean, look, if I'm going to go for Pickens, my number one strategy is to try to take 2 average players and turn them into a good player. And we should always be trying to do that, especially if you've got solid depth, and you should by this time of the season. Combining 2 players together to get 1 better player is always a fantastic strategy. But most people are on top of that now. So if you don't have that choice, Metcalf's a really good option.
You know what? The other thing with that is sometimes it's using the, for example, like another position player, like a running back and a wide receiver, to go find a team who might be struggling at RB2 and say, hey, I'll give you, for argument's sake here, I don't even know, Brian Thomas, and I don't know what the RB situation has to be, but like, the problem is like Brian Thomas is still very good. And I don't know how much of a running back upgrade. Like, would you give up Brian Thomas and Rico Dowdle to get George Pickens?
Yeah, Dowdle was kind of a name I was thinking of. There are sort of these running backs that are starting running backs, but they're definitely low-end starting running backs because they're in teams who are struggling. And I feel like they're the sort of players that you can convince someone is a good option for them. You're like, oh, this is the starting running back for the Cowboys. So I'm giving you a starting running back, and I'm only giving you a small downgrade at wide receiver. You know that you're not going to start Dowdle later this season, even though I think he is going to be the clear workhorse for Dallas. But you are getting that upgrade, and I do think there is a big upgrade from Thomas to Pickens at this stage.
Yes, and obviously, before we get into some other notable out-wide schedules, we have a couple people in the chat. Jamie, always in the chat. Jamie, by the way, happy Friday, my friend. Thank you for joining us. We also have Nihal. I want to say it is Nihal. I like it. Anyway, I'm just letting you know, guys, any questions you'll have, we'll get to your questions at the end of the show. We promise to get to those as well. Stick with us. We have a lot of fun trade talk today. Rest of season strength of schedule tool. Make sure you go check it out on razzball.com. If you haven't done it yet, folks, check out the fantasy data tab on football.razzball.com. We have a lot of good data over there as well. And the Smitty, of course. By the way, we're going to be talking about this right now. The Smitty, rest of season, you can use the tool. This is a great way to use the tool, especially with guys this close. A great way to use the tool is decide as your tiebreaker who has the better schedule. We have it on razzball.com right now. All right, let's talk about another team. Here is the New York Giants, my sweet boys. Of course, they're on a bye this week, so Malik Neighbors does get a little bit of a break. But then he has the Bucks, Cowboys, which are 2 top 10 matchups. Then he has a tougher matchup, but it's the Saints who are banged up right now in the secondary. Then he's got the Ravens, Falcons, and Colts. I mean, this schedule is absolutely insane. I believe Neighbors could really take advantage of this in the second half, especially if he gets stronger. It's funny. Is it do wide receiver rookies do better in the second half, or do they hit the rookie wall? I don't know. Figure it out. It's a conundrum. But what are your thoughts here, Ben, about Neighbors? Is this a guy you're willing to target?
It's one of those really interesting situations where he could go either way. We do think of him as a top 5 or a top 10 wide receiver, depending on the matchup, depending on the week. And I think he's going to be top 5 a lot more often with these matchups. But does Daniel Jones even keep the starting job? If he doesn't, what happens to Neighbors? Do they try to scheme it up a little bit to use the passing game a little bit more? Or do they want to lean on Tracy a little bit more after they've had success there? You just don't know what strategically is going to happen with a team that's struggling. The problem is that when a team's struggling, they know they're struggling. They know they need to change something unless they're the Seahawks. So when that happens, you need to be doing something about that. And you need to be kind of considering that risk when you're valuing a player. And I think with Neighbors, there is a lot more risk than there are for these kind of reliable top guys that we talk about. But I like risk. I want risk because risk is realistically how I get towards having the best fantasy team. Everyone starts equal and you need to take risk to move up above other people. And you have to accept that you might lose. So I like risk. I like Neighbors. I'm willing to go out and get him.
Yeah, this is like one of those guys. And by the way, like, I guess the question is this CD Lamb conundrum, because like Lamb is a guy with the big time name, and we all believe that he'll be relatively fine. But like, are you trading Lamb for these guys, Pickens and Neighbors, because you need that juice if you're on the outside looking in? What's your thoughts about that, Ben?
Yeah, I think you do. Like, that's one of those weird things where it seems kind of insane, but CD Lamb is not the same player with Cooper Rush that he is with Dak Prescott. And he's now with Cooper Rush, and he will be for the rest of the season, or Trey Lance. So that's going to hurt CeeDee Lamb badly all season. So in a dynasty league, no, absolutely not. In a dynasty league, CeeDee Lamb's still a top 3 or 4 player. But in redraft, you absolutely have to consider the possibility that you're going to get better value out of a Malik Neighbors, out of a George Pickens, even out of those Rams guys who have those tough matchups. Realistically, they're going to give you more than Lamb, who I think is at very best a very low-end wide receiver 1 at this stage, depending on the matchup in a given week.
All right. Yeah, I would say that this is kind of one of those things now where I understand trading a wide receiver for a wide receiver. I don't usually recommend those things because, like, we always talk about, like, some weeks you might win, some weeks you might lose. Like, I like to look at, can I bundle like you brought up, like a wide receiver 3 and a running back 2-ish to get Neighbors, like something along those lines. Like Neighbors, right now is the wide receiver 10 border, like low end wide receiver 1 range. I guess my question is a guy like Cortland Sutton, and let's just bring up, because we always like to bring him up, is Rico Dowdle type running back, or who's like Najee Harris type running back. Would you trade those 2 guys to go up to Neighbors?
Yeah, I would. In the vast majority of situations, I'm always going to be for taking 2 wide receiver 2, running back 2 style players and turning them into a borderline wide receiver 1 style player. You're getting that upgrade. And you need to remember that even though you're losing these 2 solid players, you can't start every player on your roster anyway. So unless you have truly appalling depth and your bench is just a minefield and there's no one of any interest, for the most part, you'll be able to just slide in the next guy most weeks and you're going to be in a pretty good situation. Now, you do need to understand when you do this sort of trade, you're going to be in big trouble over the next 2 weeks because there's 10 bye teams over the next 2 weeks. And there are going to be weeks there where you're really hurting. So you do need to incorporate that and be okay with that small hit that you're going to take. So if you're in a I need to win every week situation, you really need to look at your bye situation and see whether you maybe need that depth in those weeks.
All right. Let's shift that to a little bit of a lesser known name. A guy that's really emerged over this season, really, is Quentin Johnson. The Chargers do have the third best out wide schedule. You can even throw Josh Palmer in here to a certain extent. But listen, Quentin Johnson is starting to look like the guy in the sense of, well, he's found the end zone a lot, which is nice. But the Chargers really haven't taken off yet in the passing game. Justin Herbert hasn't done much in the sense of pass volume, but those things should change. He's got the Bengals, the Ravens, the Falcons over the next 3. Then he's got a tough matchup against the Chiefs, but then he's got the the Buccaneers, my apologies, as second. So he's got 4 of his next 5 games are against top 6 opponents in fantasy points out wide over the last 6 weeks. So my thought process here, Ben, are you willing to acquire Quentin Johnson? Is this a player you're looking for right now?
Not really. It's an interesting one where this week he is a start for me this week. I think he's interesting, but he comes with a massive amount of risk. He did have a very big game 2 weeks ago, but look at how it happened. He didn't get 10 targets. He was turning like 5 targets into 100 yards, and those were like big plays where he did some pretty special stuff or things just lined up for him properly. That's not going to happen every single week. And when you have that sort of player, you are talking about a boom-bust situation. So I'm all for taking big swings overall, but you kind of want to be taking big swings to get you a player you can rely on, and I don't think that's Johnston. I feel like he's always going to have these really small weeks where he's getting 3, 4, 5 points in a PPR league, but he's also going to have these big weeks because he's going to make some big plays. There's also always the possibility that maybe DJ Chark comes in and all of a sudden he takes a few more of those snaps as he gets healthier, and that's going to hurt you as well. So with the way the Chargers play, with the way that Johnston fits into their scheme, he's never going to be a reliable option for you.
Okay. All right, let's jump down to number 4. And that one is the Cardinals, Marvin Harrison Jr. After the bye this week, so this might be the time where you can maybe get him, especially if, for example, they do have an okay playoff schedule, but if you look at the rest of season after the bye, they have the Seahawks, which are 3rd, the Vikings 11th, Seahawks again. Then they have the Patriots, which is the 10th most fantasy points out wide, Panthers and Rams, all these matchups are inside the top 18. So pretty much all winnable matchups. Marvin Harrison's been a little up and down this season, but what's your thoughts here, Ben, on Marvin Harrison? Are you willing to kind of trade away a Darnell Mooney type or a Jalen Waddle, Terry McLaurin to get your hands on Marvin? I mean, those guys are probably less than him, but let's say Puka Nacua in a tougher schedule versus Marvin Harrison.
I mean, I think we can all say that we were disappointed by what Marvin Harrison Jr. has done so far this season, but look at his schedule over the last 7 games. He's gotten really tough matchups over the last 7 games. And yes, he's disappointed in a lot of them, but you expect players who aren't absolutely elite, Justin Jefferson-style wide receivers to struggle in tough matchups. And we're talking about a rookie in an offense where they run the ball a lot, either through James Conner or through Kyler. They don't need to throw in every single matchup. And when it's a difficult wide receiver matchup, they're just not going to throw the ball as much. They don't need to. It's not necessary for their game plan. So for that reason, he's going to have those quiet games, and you need to accept that. But you also need to know that you're going to be able to take advantage of the matchup rest of season. He's very much a buy low opportunity, but I wouldn't necessarily be going as far as saying that I'd sell a Puka Nacua for him. I feel like he's just in that next zone below that where I'm kind of selling wide receiver 2 options, like mid-range wide receiver 2 options. I might see if I can work it for someone like a Devonta Smith potentially. I feel like he's the kind of player that you can kind of convince people is a good option and that he's working. Maybe a Zay Flowers, for example, would be an option. Maybe Terry McLaurin coming off that bad game, though this is not the ideal week for it. Jaden Reed, potentially, you might be able to do for him. Those are the kind of guys that I'd be aiming to sell in this sort of situation for Marv.
What about running backs like Pollard and Stevenson?
I think both of those guys are overvalued at the moment, so I would definitely trade them. Anyone like that, where Pollard's going back into a committee or Stevenson's been very touchdown lucky the last few weeks, I feel like they're sell high opportunities, and Marv's the kind of guy that I definitely want to go and get for them.
Ben, you brought up a really good point on the early season schedule for Marvin Harrison. So I do have some backup data to back that up. So if you're just looking at the fantasy points for his rest of season schedule versus his early season schedule, it's 30% better. So the teams have allowed 30% more fantasy points out wide. That's the second highest rate, only behind George Pickens, who, by the way, is 49%. Like, it's insanely better. Honestly, George Pickens could really, man, now I'm thinking about it. I might just poke around. I have CeeDee Lamb in 2 leagues. I might just be like, hey, you want CeeDee Lamb? I'm going to take George Pickens from you. If I could do that, that'd be wonderful. But that's good to note because right now today, he's averaging about 11.5 fantasy points in PPR. That's not great. But if you factor in 30% increase, now you're talking about 14.5-ish range. That's a pretty big bump. And now that puts you into that firm, like, wide receiver 2 range rest of season. So if you could definitely trade one of those guys, I like that a lot. The last one I want to talk about here is the Houston Texans. I don't think we really need to cover Nico Collins. Obviously, if you can get your hands on Nico, please do. I would get your curious thoughts a bit on this one in the sense of how much you would be willing to offer to get Nico, but even Tank Dell to an extent. Listen, we saw them last year coexist. And honestly, sometimes having the alpha number 1 wide receiver isn't a bad thing. It takes attention away from Tank Dell, allows him to operate as the second guy, and that could be good news for him as well. They operated very well last season together as the 1-2 punch. They have the Cowboys, the Titans, the Jags, then a bye. Then they have the Dolphins, Chiefs, and Ravens, which is the number 1 matchup at the end of the year. What's your thoughts here about Nico first? Like, how much are you willing to offer to get Nico Collins?
Nico fits into that same category for me as a Malik Neighbors, as a George Pickens. We're talking about wide receiver 1s. Like, we're talking about elite options. I'm willing to pay up to go and get him. He is one of those guys that could be a league winner because he can have absolutely massive weeks and he's got pretty solid consistency. Now, he comes with more risk than a lot of those guys that are existing locked-in wide receiver 1s because he's coming off an injury, and any player that's coming off an injury, or most injuries, will have increased injury risk moving forward. Plus, you don't know what they're going to look like coming back. Do they need to ramp up a little bit? Are they going to be impacted by some sort of change in scheme while they're out? We don't know those things about Nico because he hasn't played yet. So ideally, I want to see 1 week of him. But if he has a really good week this week, all of a sudden his price is only going to go up. So you've got to consider whether that's something you can afford to wait on.
I didn't write down here is the schedule in the sense of home road splits, because, like, I got to tell you, one of the guys that really is affected by home road splits is CJ Stroud. And so this might be, so I know they get the Cowboys this week and the Jags, but then they have the bye. So the question is, like, playoff schedule: Dolphins, Chiefs, Ravens. The Ravens, I think, is a good matchup no matter what. Chiefs, probably not. But let me just see really quick. They are, oh, wow. Okay, sorry. Home against Miami, home against Baltimore. So I think 2 of those 3 weeks, I would be okay with them in both those. It's probably weeks 15, 17 where you're not sitting Nico, but I guess for the sense of Tank Dell, honestly, I think I would play him in weeks 15 and 17, even in those matchups, and then probably fade Tank Dell and the Chiefs. Is there any interest in Tank Dell maybe buying a little bit low because of the Nico Collins coming back?
Not really. Like, I wasn't particularly excited about Tank Dell even when he was the only guy in town. He hasn't really had many big games this season. He's had 1 game with over 62 yards. Like, that's not great. He's getting a reasonable amount of targets, but last week he was playing against the Lions, and that should be one of the best matchups in football. And he had 9 targets, and he had 39 yards. Like that, and that's not even including the negative rushing yards he had. Like, that's not getting me out of bed in the morning. He hasn't been over 75% snaps all season, even when there's been an injury in there. I just don't think that they're using him in the same way they did last season. It's a very different situation now. I think we're going to see a lot more of the John Mechie's getting involved, and he's essentially going to take over whatever Stephon Diggs was doing to the most part, and that's going to really hurt Tank Dell. So for me, they just see him as this wide receiver 3, even though he's technically their wide receiver 2 now, and that scares me enough that I'm not willing to go out and get him.
All right. I just want to bundle these quickly together. By the way, we want to talk a little bit about some slot schedules, just because I want to make sure everyone's aware that you could also look at the slot schedules. 3 guys that stand out are Keenan Allen, Wan'Dale Robinson, Jaden Reed. Now, Reed has kind of been hit or miss because of the amount of target competition. Wandale, of course, at one point you've brought up many times, was like leading the NFL in like targets or top targets, and then Keenan Allen's the Bears offense has been a dumpster fire. Is there any interest in any of these three guys as a trade target, knowing the slot schedules are strong?
Keenan Allen, no. They're so locked into what they're doing. They're totally unbending. This is our tactic, and we're going to ride it into the ground this season. I don't understand why that's what they're doing in Chicago, but it's clearly not working. I don't see it changing anytime soon. And Keenan Allen is just not a big enough part of that game plan to use the benefit of having a good slot schedule. Wan'Dale Robinson was getting a lot of targets, and they basically shifted it off that game plan. And it's not working for Wan'Dale anymore. He's no longer really a useful fantasy prospect. He's not someone that's got a lot of upside. He would basically need a Neighbors and Slayton injury before you were really excited about Wan'Dale. On the other hand, Jayden Reed, I think the biggest issue with Jayden Reed is that most Jayden Reed owners, and I have tried to trade for Jayden Reed in some leagues because he's had a bad couple of weeks, they seem to have blinders on. Most Jayden Reed owners are like, oh, he's fantastic. He's one of the best players around. But look at how he's been performing the last few weeks. He has been just generally poor in some games. There was a run of weeks where he had a total of 90 yards across 3 weeks, and he had good matchups in there. Now, he did bounce back last week against Detroit, but that is by far the best slot matchup in football, and it's not even close. He's really only boomed in games where you would expect him to boom. Against the Vikings, who's got a very weak slot defense, he was very good. Against the Rams, who are pretty bad against the pass, he was good. Against Detroit, who was very bad against the pass, he was good. And then against everyone else, he's getting like 50 yards on a good day. So that's not enough to get me excited. I wish the owners of Jayden Reed saw it that way, because you are going to get some upside with it, but generally you're going to have to pay up.
Brian Thomas or Jayden Reed rest of the season?
I would take Brian Thomas despite his schedule, because at least you have some clear upside once Trevor Lawrence comes back, assuming that you're already into the playoffs.
Yeah, gotcha. All right. That's all I wanted to cover there as well. But before we dive into some of the other stuff we got planned here, I know we're going to kind of run through. Let's get through some of these questions, see where we're at, and then maybe Ben will have you drop off, and we'll talk some key injuries and some this week data as well. We do have some questions here, obviously. Let's get into this first. We have Amon-Ra and Tank Dell for Pickens and Nico. I think I would take the Pickens and Nico side no matter what. What's your thoughts here, Ben?
Yeah, I think Nico and Amon-Ra are actually pretty darn close, and Pickens is a massive upgrade over Tank Dell, so I'm taking Pickens and Nico.
Okay. All right, we got Dobbins and Bucky for Jacobs, a good trade. So you're basically trading some depth for that upgrade in Josh Jacobs. I'm worried about his playoff schedule and Gus Edwards. My running back is Cook, Dobbins, Tracy, Bucky, Brooks, and Estime. So basically, essentially right now, it sounds like your RB1 is Cook. Tracy could fit in there too from time to time, but Jacobs would probably lock in your RB2 spot. But then you still have, well, Brooks, we don't know, and Estime are big question marks here. Are you willing to trade that depth of Dobbins and Bucky to get Josh Jacobs?
Yeah, I would certainly do this. Even if one of them goes down, and there's always that risk with running backs, you've still got two solid running backs. So assuming that your wide receiver room is at least functional, you're going to be fine for that flex spot. And I think this is a good option for you.
I would say just another thing too is I don't know. Ed, do you have any thoughts about Jonathan Brooks? Like I don't know what to expect of him this season with the record and Chuba playing so well. But like I almost feel like this kid could be dynamic, But what's your thoughts about Brooks? Because another thing I'm thinking is who's the Chuba owner? Like I would love to see who's on their bench and say, hey, do you want Brooks? You figure out the Panthers situation. I don't want to figure that out. Or is Brooks someone you're like, got to see how it goes type situation?
I mean, look, I hated Brooks coming into the season. I had no interest in him, and I still have no interest. I don't think that this is a situation where he's going to produce year one. I think he's going to really struggle to be truly explosive and ready to go out of the gate. I feel like he's going to be at best in the committee. Honestly, if you own Brooks, you need a Hubbard injury. If there's no injury to Chuba Hubbard, Brooks is going to be useless to you all season. So I feel like you need to consider him as a handcuff. And realistically, there's better handcuffs out there where you need an injury. I would get a Tyler Algier. I would get even Blake Corum. Braylon Allen, Ray Davis, all of those guys, if they get an injury ahead of them, they're heading into kind of wide running back one territory. That's not the case with Brooks. If you get an injury to Hubbard, he's still not a running back one. What is the upside here? What is going to mean that you're starting him over a Cook or a Tracy or someone like that? For me, he's very much a sell high at the moment.
Would you trade Brooks for either Ray Davis or Devin Singletary?
Not for Singletary, because I feel like the upside of Singletary is still about the upside of Brooks. But, and realistically...
Now, this is just handcuff question because he has Cook. If Cook goes down, Ray Davis could be a league winner.
He absolutely could be. I think Ray Davis is pretty close in value. The difference with Brooks compared to Ray Davis is that if he gets 2 running back injuries, all of a sudden Brooks is someone that can slide in and offer a functional floor, whereas I don't think you're ever going to want to start Ray Davis on a given week. So the fact that Brooks will offer a little bit of a floor means that he probably has slightly more value in this situation. But if you've got some depth where you've got a solid amount of running backs and then Brooks is kind of your upside guy, there's more upside elsewhere.
Audric Estime, by the way. I know the group chat, Rasball guys weren't excited. I'm in. I'm excited. I think he could be the Zamir White down the stretch of last year. So I'm excited to see what he could do. This week, by the way, the Falcons are really banged up in the front 7. So I'm excited to see what Estime can do.
Everywhere. They've got so many defensive injuries.
We're going to get there. We're going to get there. We got some injuries to talk about, too. I'm excited. All right. The Smitty, we got Devonta Smith or Dell rest of season. What's your thoughts here, Ben?
I mean, I think you probably guessed based on what I was talking about earlier. I prefer Devonta Smith. I don't love either of them, realistically, but Smith is the guy I would rather have the two. The good thing about Smith is that if you get an injury to A.J. Brown, you know that Smith is going to offer some increased value. With Dell, if you get that injury to Nico Collins, we've seen, didn't make that much of a difference. So I do like the upside of Smith a little bit more.
Yeah, I know we covered Dell today, but it's not that far off. The Eagles have the 8th best rest of season out wide schedule, so I'm going to lean Devonta Smith there as well. Would you trade David Montgomery for Kenneth Walker? Interesting dynamic here, the Smitty. What's your thoughts here, Ben?
Yes. Next question.
I agree.
Definitively yes.
Honestly, that's good for us. We're not usually good at not giving detail. No. I like it. All right. Would you trade Drake London for Kyron? I would also trade. Yes, I would. I would take Kyron Williams 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. Look, unless it's a PPR league and this is somehow your flex guy, yes, I would definitely prefer Kyron Williams.
Yeah, I got to tell you, Drake London's surprisingly involved in the slot this year, which I like a lot. They got him moving around a lot. And so that's good, but his schedule isn't great rest of season. The Falcons, if you just look at total fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, they have a bottom 5 rest of season schedule. So that's notable there. All right. What would you trade AJ Brown away for picks in a rebuild? 2 first rounders. So if you're a rebuilding team, dynasty, is 2 first round picks enough for AJ Brown?
It's one of those tough situations where if you're in a rebuild, AJ Brown, I mean, he's only 27. Like, we're not talking about a guy who's ancient. It feels like he's been around forever, but he came in really young. You can easily get another 3, 4, maybe even 5 good years out of AJ Brown. So it's very possible he'll still have value later on. So it kind of depends where you are in your rebuild. I think that if you're very early in your rebuild, then maybe, yes, it makes sense. But if you feel like you're probably going to be competing in a year or 2, maybe just hold on to Brown. Like I do think that he's still going to be an elite wide receiver in 2 years' time.
Yeah, and the other problem is with these trades is that you're probably going to be giving him to a good team, and that good team is going to have low first-round picks. So you're probably going to have 2 low first-round picks. Not like you're going to get a top 5 pick in the next draft. So, yeah, you know what? The other thing, too, is like sometimes like if you're really thinking you want to look to the future, honestly, a Brandon Ayuk trade, maybe trying to find the team who has Ayuk right now, who's on IR, find their team, see if they're good, then offer them AJ Brown, Ayuk, and then get some more picks. So you have another receiver who you know could play at this level and also getting picks. So maybe something like that makes a little sense as well. Maybe a Rashid Rice even. I like that too. You go Rice or Brandon Ayuk, get 2 picks with it. Then that makes sense because now long-term you have that wide receiver you know can play in the league and you're getting the assets as well.
Yeah, I really like that idea of Rashid Rice. I think anytime you're targeting a player who's going to be out for this season but you don't care, I think that's a big win. Chris Godwin would be another one you can consider. Obviously, he's a little bit on the older side as well. But if you're in a situation where next year is your target, Chris Godwin is an option you can pick up as well. And I really like what you're talking about with which team you trade it to, like especially when it comes to first-round picks. You want to be targeting that guy in your league who doesn't realize how bad his team is. And he's like, oh, all I need is this one player, and suddenly my team's going to be winning the league. And he's wrong. So you need to know who that guy in your league is, who's delusional in your league, and target him and try to give him your best players, because his first-round picks are always going to have value because his team sucks.
Now, listen, I want to tell you a story about a man last year meeting me that was delusional. I made it into the Dynasty League barely as the 6th seed, and I ran the table, baby. So it was awesome. But I was delusional. Amari Cooper dropped 40 one week, and that's how I won the second round game. So I'll tell you, it's definitely, I agree with Ben. You want to try to find that team that will get knocked out in the first round, so you get a nice 7-8 pick instead of the 12th pick in the draft. But I hear you. The same thing goes with here. I think you're adding in Swift now. It kind of takes away a little bit of the value, because really, to be honest with you, is Swift worth a first round pick in Dynasty? Probably. And then AJ Brown and a first. Rashee Rice and a first for A.J. Brown. It seems kind of fair. I don't hate it, but I would still kind of shop a little bit. I think I could probably get a little more for especially if the team's really in a win now mode. But that's not terrible. Which thoughts here, Ben?
I think it depends on the value of that first round pick. If we're talking a very late first round pick, probably not. You're not going to get great value from that late first round pick unless it's like an 8 or 10 league team league, sorry. But if it's like an early first, then I would certainly do this.
All right. Last one, and we're going to let Ben kind of run out of here. We do have a question here. My other wide receivers are Jennings, Evans, and Dell. So would you rather have Kyron or Walker rest of season?
Kyron. Definitely Kyron. I just think you can trust what they're doing there a little bit more. You know that he is the clear starter.
I wasn't prepared for running back data today, the Schmitty, but I appreciate the question. It's so in the adjusted line yard rest of season metric that I have, they're 4 and 5, both awesome. I'm going to lean Kyron as well. All right, Ben, before we close out for you, we're going to let you go. I'm going to stay on and just talk some quick injuries. But Ben, before we close out the show, tell the people kind of where they can find your content and what other things you got upcoming at Razzball.
Okay, so obviously at Razzball, every week, streamers and stashes for me. Love my streamers and stashes. And of course, I do the full slot versus wide analysis. You saw it rest of season today, but if you're wondering who is the best slot versus wide matchups for this week specifically, my article just dropped. You saw it on the front page of the website when we were on there before. That is what you want to go look at. That's where you're going to find all the best wide receiver starts and sits. And if you're unsure, and you want to know more about my rankings of data, you can also head over to the Fantasy First Down YouTube channel, where I kind of have some longer form looks where I break down my rankings. Going to be a little bit later this week because I've got a lot on this weekend, but that is basically the kind of thing you can expect from my stuff. It's more longer form discussions about that sort of stuff as well. Plus, if you ever want my rankings, you can go to ffdfantasyfootball.com, but don't spend too much time away from Razzball because that's where all the good stuff is.
Yes. That's why I let him talk, people, all right? He knows what the right thing to say. All right, Ben, go do your thing, buddy. We appreciate you being on, man. I will see you next week. Talk to you later.
Thank you.
All right. Let's talk some key injuries, folks. All right, we're doing a little solo. Before we close the show, I just want to talk about some injuries that popped up. And by the way, make sure you join us on Sunday. We do a live show for 2 hours before kickoff, and we break down all the key injuries across the board. But since it's the slot versus wide show today, we like to talk about some of the key secondary and receiving core injuries that could impact your lineups in Week 11. First, I want to talk about is the Broncos-Falcons game. The Falcons are going to be down 2 of their 3 starting corners. Now, granted, they're still going to have their top corner this week, but Cortland Sutton is one of my favorite players this week. Also, I like to play his props a little bit. Now, the Falcons play a ton of zone so far this season, so I'm not necessarily worried about him being shadowed this week by freaking God. Why I can't remember his name now? Stupid. Should have had the name ready to go. Why can't I think of his name? Just give me 1 second. Dead air, baby. Dead air. Falcons cornerback. Why can't I think of his name? And now it's not loading. That's all right. Whatever. I'll get to it later. It is AJ Terrell. Jesus Christmas, Bob. All right, AJ Terrell he does move around the formation, but they play a ton of zone. I think Cortland Sutton definitely could play well in this matchup with those injuries to the secondary. The next one is the Chiefs-Bills game. The Bills are going to be down Keon Coleman and Dalton Kincaid, and Amari Cooper is wearing a cast on his wrist. One of my favorite plays this week, too, is Khalil Shakir in the slot. By the way, the Chiefs have allowed a ton of fantasy points into the slot this season, so Khalil Shakir should definitely get a lot of looks. He's got a good baseline with targets. That offense should really, kind of run through him outside of James Cook and Josh Allen, so I do like that matchup as well with the injuries. Jumping down to the Dolphins-Raiders game, I want to talk quickly about Nate Hobbs, who's their top interior slot cornerback. He's one of their best cornerbacks on the team for the Raiders. That's good news. Tyreek Hill, by the way, is about 60-40 slot this season in fantasy production. And honestly, I think this is the week where he can kind of break out a little bit. So I really like Tyreek Hill and DFS and player props this week. Jumping over to the Dolphins-Raiders on the same side, on the other side, Dolphins will be down outside cornerback Kendall Fuller, and they will also be down potentially Jalen Ramsey, who's dealing with an injury as well. So down their two top cornerbacks potentially in this game. Jacoby Myers, I think, by the way, I love Scott Turner and Norv Turner running this offense. Norv Turner is historically known for featuring a number one wide receiver. And I honestly think Jacoby Myers could definitely be an okay start, especially if Ramsey is ruled out in this game. Well, a couple more. The Seahawks are going to be down Noah Fant this week. Listen, JSN has not been great this season. With DK Metcalf back, it's tough to trust him. But I do think Noah Fant being out might solidify him maybe as a low-end wide receiver 3 if you're desperate and need a start. On the flip side, Tre'Davious Ward, top outside cornerback, is out this week for the 49ers. That is big-time news for DK Metcalf. I know he's coming back to a tough spot against the 49ers, but without their top corner, you got to like DK as well. And the last one I want to talk about is the Titans secondary, still very banged up. L'Jarius Sneed and Quandre Diggs are both out against the Vikings. Listen, I mean, we're all excited about Justin Jefferson this week, but honestly, the Titans have started giving up more production out wide over the last 6 weeks. So if you're really looking for maybe a Addison start this week, if you need to start him, those injuries should definitely help as well. All right, that's all we got today, folks. We do really appreciate you guys jumping on the Razzball Fantasy YouTube channel. And make sure you subscribe, give us a like, give us a review, and make sure you join us on Sunday live for 2 hours before kickoff. We're going to do start-sit questions. We also talk key injuries, weather updates, everything you know up until kickoff. We also go to razzball.com. We have great articles, great content, the slot versus wide tool, the rest of season home road splits. We have it all on Razzball. So make sure you go check that out as well. We want to thank all of you for joining us today. We couldn't do it without you guys. We really do appreciate it. Thank you for joining us. Once again, we are